In the decades before Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court was the subject of intense partisan and ideological conflict. The Warren Court, beginning at least with Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, was bitterly attacked for judicial activism, exemplified supposedly by its decisions expanding the rights of criminal defendants, prohibiting state-sponsored prayer in public schools, and, in cases like Brown, trying to uproot Jim Crow segregation. Richard Nixon's successful presidential campaign in 1968 prominently featured attacks on the Warren Court. Against that background, it's natural to think that Roe v. Wade, decided on January 1973, less than 4 years after Chief Justice Warren's retirement, was simply a continuation of Warren-era conflicts between liberals who were identifying new constitutional rights and conservatives who were trying to preserve the status quo. But that is not an accurate account either of the political reaction to Roe or of the relationship between Roe and the controversies that surrounded the Warren Court. Roe was a thoroughly bipartisan decision, and it scrambled Warren-era ideological lines. Of the 7 members of the Roe majority, 5 had been appointed by Republican presidents. 3 of the 7, enough to reverse the outcome, were appointed by Nixon, who had vowed that his appointments would change the direction of the court from what it had been in the Warren era. Those 3 included Justice Harry Blackmun, the author of the opinion in Roe, and its most passionate defender among the justices. One of the 2 dissenters in Roe, Justice Byron White, had been appointed by a Democratic president, John Kennedy, and was often aligned with the Warren Court majority. Roe was decided less than 2 years after the deaths of 2 of the central figures of the Warren Court. Had they still been on the court, it would have been even more obvious how Roe crossed partisan and ideological lines. Justice John Marshall Harlan was the Warren Court's most prominent dissenter, but he can fairly be called the godfather of Roe v. Wade. He had advocated a constitutional right to reproductive freedom since 1961. Justice Hugo Black had been an intellectual leader on the Warren Court, noted for his commitment to freedom of speech and constitutional protections for criminal defendants, but he would certainly have dissented in Roe. So just as there were conservatives who supported Roe, there were liberal critics of Roe. Many of these critics believed that there should be a right to abortion, but they thought the court made a mistake by establishing that right itself, at least in the way that Roe did, rather than leaving the issue to politics. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, then a judge on the District of Columbia Circuit, was one of the liberal critics of Roe, although her criticism was qualified. Yale Law School professor John Hart Ely, a former law clerk for Chief Justice Warren, was an emphatic defender of the Warren Court, but he published one of the most strongly worded attacks on Roe. The title of Ely's article, "The Wages of Crying Wolf," captured the reversal of liberal and conservative positions that Roe precipitated.